who really burned the Library of Alexandria. The common story points to one man and one fire. But that story is a lie, a convenient fiction that papers over 1,000 years of neglect, ambition, and violence. The truth is not a single inferno. It is a slow, creeping decay. Tonight, we will investigate history's greatest cold case, the death of the ancient world's mind. We'll sift through the ashes of myth to find the difficult truth. If you enjoy untangling the complexities of the past, consider liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into history. And let us know in the comments, who do you think is the most famous suspect in this ancient crime? Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight in Bedtime History, we investigate the long, slow death of the great Library of Alexandria. Our story begins not with an ending, but with a magnificent beginning. Before the accusations and the smoke, there was a dream of collecting all the world's knowledge under one roof. Our story starts in the wake of a giant. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE, he left behind an empire that stretched from Greece to India, but he left behind no clear heir. His vast kingdom fractured, carved up by his most ambitious generals, the Diadochi. One of these men was Ptolemy I, son of Lagus, a clever and cautious strategist who had been Alexander's childhood friend. While others fought for the whole empire, Ptolemy secured for himself its richest prize, the land of Egypt. And from his new capital, the coastal city of Alexandria, he sought to build a dynasty that would last for centuries. But military might and golden treasuries were not enough. To be truly great, to be seen as the legitimate heirs of Hellenic culture, the Ptolemies needed something more. They needed to dominate the world, not just with swords, but with intellect. Their new capital had to become the center of the known world, a beacon of learning so bright it would cast Athens itself into shadow. This was the Ptolemaic vision, a grand and audacious goal. The seed of this idea likely came from an Athenian exile named Demetrius of Phaleron. A student of Aristotle's school, the Lyceum, Demetrius understood the power of organized knowledge. He envisioned an institution that would dwarf his mentors. The Lyceum in Athens was a place where scholars could walk and discuss, a home for research and teaching. But what Demetrius proposed for Alexandria was on an entirely different scale. He proposed the creation of a Mausoleum, a shrine of the Muses. This was not simply a building. It was a research institute, a government-funded think tank dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge in every conceivable field. It would have lecture halls, private study rooms, observatories, medical facilities, and even a botanical and zoological garden. The scholars who worked there would receive generous state salaries, free meals, and lodging. Their only task was to think, to discover, and to write. And at the heart of the Mausoleum, serving its every need, would be its library, the Great Library of Alexandria. Founded around 295 BCE, it was, from its inception, the engine of this intellectual paradise. It was to be the repository for every scroll, every piece of writing from every culture. Ptolemy I laid the foundation, but it was his son, Ptolemy II, called Philadelphus, who truly supercharged the project. Driven by a fierce, competitive spirit, he poured the kingdom's immense wealth into the library's growth. He sent agents across the Mediterranean and beyond, with orders to acquire texts at any cost. This wasn't just about learning. It was about prestige. It was a statement of power. The library in Mausoleum, were not placed in a dusty corner of the city. They were built in the Bruchion, the royal quarter, adjacent to the king's own palace. This proximity was symbolic. It showed that knowledge and power were intertwined, that the mind of the kingdom was as important as its monarch. As the collection grew at a staggering rate, a second, daughter library was established at the temple of the god Serapis, the Serapeum, in another part of the city. It was built to handle the overflow, a testament to their incredible success. The ambition was boundless, so much so that Ptolemy III enacted a stunning policy. Any ship that docked in Alexandria's busy harbor was to be searched not for contraband, but for books. Any scrolls found were taken to the library. There, skilled scribes would meticulously copy the text onto fresh papyrus. The copy would then be returned to the owner. The original, however, was kept for the library's collection. It was an act of scholarly piracy, a clear declaration that all knowledge, ultimately, belonged in Alexandria. This was more than a library. It was a bold attempt to create a universal mind. And so, from this grand vision, a place of wonder began to function. It became a factory of knowledge, a humming, vibrant center of intellectual life, unlike anything the world had ever seen. Within its colonnaded halls, the human mind was taking flight. It wasn't merely a silent warehouse for papyrus. It was a living, breathing organism, a place of debate, collaboration, and revolutionary discovery. The sheer scale of the collection is difficult to comprehend. Ancient sources provide conflicting numbers, but estimates for its peak holdings range from 40,000 to an astonishing 400,000 scrolls. Even the lowest figure represents a collection of knowledge that had no equal in the ancient world. Imagine long halls, the walls lined with countless pigeonholes, each one filled with a rolled papyrus scroll, tagged with a small strip identifying its contents. The air would have smelled of papyrus and ink, a quiet temple dedicated to the written word. But it was the minds at work within these walls that truly defined the institution. The first head librarian, Zenodotus of Ephesus, was given a monumental task: to organize the chaotic world of Greek literature. He focused on the epic poet Homer, whose works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, existed in countless differing versions across the Greek world. Zenodotus gathered all the manuscripts he could find, compared them line by line, and edited them to create the first standardized, critical editions. He was, in essence, inventing the entire field of literary criticism, ensuring that the version of Homer we read today has its roots in his meticulous work. His successor, the poet and scholar Callimachus, faced an even greater challenge: cataloging everything. The result was the Pinax, or tables. This was a 120-volume bibliography of the entire library. It listed works by author and category, providing a short biography and the first line of the text for identification. It was the world's first library catalog, an intellectual map of all human thought as it existed then. A book about all the other books. But the work was not limited to literature. In Alexandria, science flourished. A man from Cyrene named Eratosthenes became the third head librarian. Using the most basic of tools, he achieved something extraordinary. He had heard that on the summer solstice, in the southern city of Syene, the sun cast no shadow at noon. Yet in Alexandria, on that same day, a vertical stick did cast a shadow. By measuring the angle of that shadow and knowing the distance between the two cities, he used simple geometry to calculate the circumference of the earth. His result was stunningly accurate, off by only a small percentage. In an age of myth, Eratosthenes was measuring the world with reason. At the same time, a mathematician named Euclid was walking these halls. He gathered all the known principles of geometry and organized them into a single logical work called Elements. For over 2,000 years, his book would remain the primary textbook for teaching the subject. It is arguably the most influential textbook in all of history, a masterpiece of deductive reasoning born from the scholarly calm of the Mouseion. Meanwhile, inventors like Hero of Alexandria were tinkering with mechanics. He created early steam-powered devices, automatic doors that opened with the heat of an altar fire, and complex fountains. These were not mere novelties. They were the first whispers of industrial science. The library was also a place of profound cultural exchange. It was here that 72 Jewish scholars, according to legend, were commissioned by Ptolemy II to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. The result, known as the Septuagint, made these sacred texts accessible to the wider Hellenistic world and would become the Old Testament for early Christianity. It was a bridge built of words. Medicine, too, took giant leaps forward. Doctors like Erophilus and Erasistratus were given the unprecedented and deeply controversial permission to perform human dissections. For the first time, they were able to accurately describe the nervous system, the function of the heart valves, and the difference between arteries and veins. This unparalleled center of knowledge was the beating heart of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a symbol of its power and a magnet for the brilliant. But as a new power began to rise across the Mediterranean, the library would find itself caught in the crossfire of ambition. Its peaceful existence was about to be shaken. Our investigation now turns to the first and most famous suspect in this ancient crime. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. The year was 48 BCE. The golden age of the Ptolemies was fading, and a new power, Rome, was casting its shadow over the entire Mediterranean. Caesar arrived in Alexandria not as a scholar, but as a general, pursuing his rival Pompey the Great. He found the city embroiled in a bitter civil war between the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII and his clever, ambitious older sister Cleopatra. Caesar, with only a small force, chose to back Cleopatra, a decision that left him besieged and trapped within the royal quarter of the city, the very same quarter that housed the Mouseion and the Great Library. The situation was dire. The Egyptian fleet, loyal to the boy king, controlled the harbor, threatening to cut off Caesar's escape and prevent reinforcements from arriving. Caesar, ever the decisive commander, made a fateful choice. He ordered his men to set fire to the Alexandrian ships docked in the harbor. It was a desperate, purely military tactic. The goal was simple: to neutralize a threat. But fire is a difficult weapon to control. A strong wind was blowing that day. The flames leaped from the wooden ships, carried by the breeze from the harbor inland. Soon, the fire had spread to the city's docks and the warehouses that lined the waterfront. Chaos erupted. Panic filled the streets. It is here that the story of the library's destruction begins. Several later Roman writers, including the philosopher Seneca and the historian Livy, describe the event. They speak of a great fire, and they mention the destruction of a vast number of scrolls. The number most often cited is 40,000. For centuries, this account was taken as fact. Caesar's fire became the single dramatic event that annihilated the ancient world's greatest collection of knowledge. But the truth, when we sift through the ashes of the story, is far more complicated. There is a significant scholarly debate about what exactly burned that day. Was it the Great Library itself? The magnificent marble building attached to the Mausoleum? Or was it something else? Many modern historians argue that the fire never reached the library proper. They suggest the blaze was likely contained to the waterfront district. What burned, they propose, was not the library itself, but one or more warehouses near the docks. These warehouses may have been storing tens of thousands of scrolls, perhaps copies intended for export, or new acquisitions waiting to be processed and cataloged. The loss of 40,000 scrolls was undoubtedly a terrible blow, a tragedy. But the destruction of a storage facility is not the same as the destruction of the parent institution. We have a key witness from this period. The geographer Strabo was working in Alexandria just a few decades after Caesar's visit. In his extensive writings about the city, he describes the Mausoleum in detail, mentioning its community of scholars and its lecture halls. Yet, he makes no mention of a grand, world-famous library attached to it. This silence is puzzling. Does it mean the library was gone? Or does it suggest that by Strabo's time, its status had already been diminished, that it was no longer the centerpiece it once was? The evidence is ambiguous. Perhaps the most compelling piece of evidence that the institution survived comes from its chief benefactor, Cleopatra. Years later, her Roman lover, Mark Antony, reportedly gifted her 200,000 scrolls from the Library of Pergamum to help replenish Alexandria's collection. This story suggests two crucial things. First, that a significant loss had indeed occurred, one large enough to warrant such a magnificent gift. But second, and more importantly, it shows that the library was still standing. It was a living institution, capable of receiving, housing, and absorbing a massive new collection. Caesar's fire, therefore, was not the fatal blow. It was a deep and terrible wound, but it was not the end. The library survived, wounded but intact. This event, however, marked the beginning of a new era, an era of decline under a new master. While Caesar's fire serves as a dramatic and convenient starting point for the library's destruction, it was not the death blow. The institution carried on. The true, more insidious poison was not a single inferno, but a slow, creeping decay that had begun even before the Romans arrived, and which accelerated dramatically after they took control. The real story of the library's end is not one of sudden catastrophe, but of a long, sad decline born from neglect. A century before Caesar even set foot in Alexandria, the library suffered a massive, self-inflicted wound. In 145 BCE, the ruler Ptolemy VIII, nicknamed Physgon, or Potbelly, began a brutal purge. He was a cruel and paranoid king who saw the cosmopolitan, free-thinking scholars of the Mausoleum as a political threat. He turned on them, expelling nearly every foreign intellectual from the city. The great minds of the Greek world, who had been the engine of the library's fame, were scattered across the Mediterranean. This event created a devastating brain drain. While the scrolls remained, the vibrant intellectual community that gave them meaning was broken. The spirit of inquiry was attacked from within by its own patron. This internal rot was compounded when Egypt finally ceased to be an independent kingdom. After the defeat of Cleopatra and Mark Antony in 30 BCE, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. With this transition, the library lost its most vital asset, its lavish royal patronage. The Ptolemies had seen the library as their crown jewel, a profound symbol of their cultural supremacy and a source of immense pride. They funded it with a kind of passion that only comes from personal ambition. The Roman emperors, however, had a different perspective. For them, Egypt was primarily a source of grain and wealth. Alexandria was a strategic port, the breadbasket of their empire. A Greek center of learning, however prestigious, was simply not a strategic priority. The generous state funding that had paid for scholars' salaries, for the acquisition of new texts, and for the constant, painstaking work of recopying and preserving fragile papyrus scrolls began to dry up. The slow, quiet work of maintenance faltered. Papyrus is an organic material. In the humid Mediterranean climate, it is vulnerable to dampness, insects, and simple aging. Without a dedicated staff of scribes to create fresh copies, the ancient scrolls would have slowly but surely crumbled into dust. As the funding receded, so did the institution's intellectual ambition. The focus of the scholars who remained subtly shifted. The great age of new scientific discovery, of measuring the earth and mapping the stars, gave way to a more conservative era. Scholarship turned inward, focusing on literary commentary and the preservation of past knowledge rather than the pursuit of new frontiers. The Mausian became less of a beacon for revolutionary thought and more like a quiet, prestigious university, respectable, but no longer on the cutting edge of human knowledge. This period powerfully illustrates a difficult truth. Neglect can be just as destructive as fire. The slow withdrawal of resources, the gradual loss of purpose, and the creeping apathy of its new masters did more lasting damage than Caesar's flames ever could. It was a fire in slow motion, burning away the institution's soul long before its walls would fall. The wound inflicted by Caesar's fire was deep, but the library, as an institution, had survived. Yet its recovery was hampered by the arrival of a new master. A master who saw Egypt not as a cradle of culture to be nurtured, but as a resource to be managed, a problem to be contained. The Roman Empire was practical. It was efficient. And in its vast, intricate bureaucracy, the dream of a universal library began to feel like a frivolous and expensive luxury. The era of slow decay had now given way to the era of the uncaring empire. When Augustus became the first Roman emperor, he formally organized Egypt as a province, but it was a province like no other. Wary of its immense wealth and its history of powerful rulers, Augustus declared Egypt his personal domain, governed directly by an official loyal only to him. This was a calculated political move. He understood that any ambitious senator who gained control of Egypt's colossal grain harvests could potentially starve the city of Rome itself, holding the entire empire hostage. Egypt was simply too important to be left to the normal mechanisms of provincial government. And so, the land of the pharaohs became the emperor's private estate. This decision set the tone for centuries of Roman rule. Egypt was a treasure chest and a granary, its primary purpose to feed and fund Rome. Its cultural institutions, a legacy of a conquered Greek dynasty, were secondary concerns. The steady, lavish stream of gold from the Ptolemaic kings, which had flowed like a Nile itself to fund the Mausian, now slowed to a trickle. The funding became inconsistent, often slashed during the empire's frequent economic crises. When legions were needed to fight on the German frontier, or when a fire in Rome required a massive rebuilding project, the budget for a Greek library in a distant province was an easy and obvious cut to make. Imagine the tangible effects of this. The once bustling scribal workshops, where dozens of skilled hands worked to copy and repair aging texts, would have grown quiet. The ink pots dried up. The orders for fresh, high-quality papyrus from the Nile Delta went unfulfilled. The very work of preservation, the lifeblood of a library in the ancient world, began to falter. This was not a dramatic fire. It was a slow, administrative strangulation. This administrative apathy changed the very nature of the institution. The prestigious role of head librarian, once held by the world's leading scholars like the polymath Eratosthenes, simply vanished from the historical record. It was replaced by a series of administrators, officials appointed directly by the emperor. These were often Roman equestrians, men of business and politics, whose primary qualification was not their intellectual brilliance, but their unwavering loyalty and their ability to file reports on time. The leadership of the library shifted from the hands of thinkers to the hands of bureaucrats. With this change, the institution's grand mission died. The spirit of universal acquisition, of sending agents across the sea to hunt for every known text, was gone forever. The library ceased to be an active predator of knowledge. It became a passive custodian of a legacy, a quiet and respectable institution that no longer drove the conversation of the world. There were, of course, exceptions. The Emperor Claudius, himself a bookish scholar and historian, was said to have built an addition to the Mouseion in the 1st century. But this was a brief flicker of imperial interest in a long, slow twilight of neglect. One man's passion could not reverse the overarching trend of apathy. The most relentless enemy remained time itself, abetted by indifference. The very scrolls that made up the collection were fragile. Papyrus, exposed to the humid air of the Mediterranean coast, is a delicate material. It decays. It grows brittle with age. It mildews in the damp, and it is fed upon by insects. The only way to preserve a text was to have it meticulously recopied by a skilled scribe every few generations. Under the Ptolemies, this was a top priority. Under Roman administrators with shrinking budgets, it became a low-priority task, perpetually postponed. Quietly, invisibly, within the silent halls, countless unique texts were likely turning to dust on their shelves, lost forever not to fire, but to a lack of funds. At the same time, the city of Alexandria itself was becoming less stable. It was a multicultural metropolis, a crucible of peoples, but its diverse populations of Greeks, Egyptians, and Jews often clashed violently. The sounds of mob riots would periodically fill the air. The smell of smoke from street brawls and small fires was not uncommon. This simmering instability made Alexandria a less attractive and sometimes dangerous place for the world's best minds to gather. The quiet scholarly sanctuary envisioned by the first Ptolemy was now located in a loud and often volatile city. The slow administrative decay, the quiet crumbling of the scrolls, and the growing unrest in the streets all combined to weaken the great library from within. It was being hollowed out, left vulnerable. And when the Roman Empire itself began to fracture, the weakened institution would be standing directly in the path of the storm. The slow, quiet decline of the library and its Mouseion created a profound vulnerability. For centuries, they had been protected by the awesome stability of an empire. But in the middle of the 3rd century, that empire fell into a deep and violent crisis. The Roman world was tearing itself apart. This was the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of near total collapse. A succession of barracks emperors, raised to power by their armies and just as quickly murdered, created constant civil war. The currency was debased into worthlessness, leading to hyperinflation. Plague swept through the population. and the frontiers buckled, allowing for breakaway provinces to form their own kingdoms. It was in this power vacuum that a formidable challenger arose from the east, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, a brilliant and ambitious ruler who claimed descent from Cleopatra. She carved out her own vast empire from Rome's eastern territories. And in the year 270 A, her forces conquered Egypt. Her victory, however, was short-lived. A new Roman emperor, Aurelian, a stern and unforgiving soldier from the Balkans, was determined to reunite the broken empire. He was known as Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world, and his methods were brutal and efficient. In 272 AD, he marched his legions to Alexandria to retake the city. What followed was not a simple surrender. The Palmyrene garrison and the citizens loyal to Zenobia resisted fiercely. The fighting was not on the outskirts of the city, but in its very heart. It was a brutal campaign of urban warfare, and the fiercest combat took place in the Bruchion. This, tragically, was the ancient royal quarter, the district of palaces of unimaginable luxury, art, and for 500 years, the home of the Gnossian and the great Library of Alexandria. The battle for the Bruchion was not a surgical strike. It was a sack. Aurelian's forces fought street by street, building by building, leaving utter devastation in their wake. Imagine the sounds of that battle: the thunder of Roman siege engines, the sharp crack of marble colonnades collapsing under their own weight, the roar of fires consuming ancient wooden roofs, and the screams of the dying. The 4th century historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing with the sober tone of a former soldier, described the quarter as being so completely destroyed that its walls were razed to the ground, leaving it a desolate wasteland. He stated, quite simply, that the district had been annihilated. It is here, in the rubble and the bloodshed of Aurelian's reconquest, that many modern scholars place the true death of the original great library. There was no single, accidental fire. There was the systematic destruction of an entire section of the city during a brutal war. The library was not a specific target. It was simply in the way, a casualty of a conflict far larger than itself, its priceless scrolls consumed by the flames of war alongside homes and palaces. The evidence for this catastrophic end is compelling, found mostly in what is not said afterwards. After the year 272 A, the historical record falls silent. There are no further mentions, no passing references to the great library at the Gnossian. It simply disappears from history, like a ship sinking beneath the waves. The institution that had been the intellectual center of the world for half a millennium was likely shattered beyond repair, its buildings ruined, its remaining scrolls burned, looted, or scattered in the chaos. This was not a slow decay. It was a violent, definitive end. And yet, knowledge is a resilient thing. While the great institution in the Bruchion was gone, its spirit and a significant portion of its collection had a lifeboat. For centuries, a daughter library had existed in another part of the city. Any scholars who survived the siege, and any scrolls they could rescue from the ruins, would have made their way there. The great heart of the library had been destroyed, but a smaller, flickering flame still burned elsewhere. The migration to the Temple of Serapis had begun. With the Bruchion in ruins and the great library gone, the intellectual heart of Alexandria moved. It relocated to a different part of the city, to a place that was both a temple and a library. For over a century after the sack by Aurelian, the legacy of Alexandrian scholarship was preserved within the formidable walls of the Serapeum. This was the flickering flame that carried the light of the old library forward, a final bastion of classical learning. The Serapeum was a magnificent structure, one of the grandest temples in the entire Roman Empire. It was dedicated to Serapis, a hybrid god ingeniously created by the first Ptolemy to bridge the cultural gap between his Greek and Egyptian subjects. Serapis combined aspects of the Egyptian god of the underworld, Osiris, with the sacred bull Apis, and blended them with Greek deities like Zeus and Hades. The temple built in his honor was a powerful symbol of this fusion. It sat upon a high plateau in the city, a man-made acropolis, reached by a grand staircase of 100 steps. To approach it was to be awed. Inside its sacred precinct, courtyards were lined with statues and sphinx, and at its center stood the colossal cult statue of the god himself, a figure said to be so majestic it inspired reverence in all who saw it. It was a fortress for a god, and within this fortress there was a library. From the time of the Ptolemies, this temple had housed the famous daughter library, originally established to handle the overflow from the main collection. Now, after the destruction of 272 AD, it was no longer a supplement. It was the sole heir. It became the primary repository for what remained of Alexandria's vast collection of scrolls, and the new center for the city's intellectual life. The atmosphere must have been different from the old Mausion. Here, scholarship was conducted in the shadow of divinity. The quiet rustle of papyrus in the reading rooms would have mixed with the distant sound of priestly chants from the temple sanctuary. It was a place where reason and faith coexisted. While its collection was almost certainly smaller than the Great Library at its absolute peak, it was still one of the most significant libraries in the world. For more than 100 years, it was the focal point for the city's remaining pagan scholars. Within its colonnades, the work of learning continued. It was in this final phase of the Alexandrian intellectual tradition that we meet some of its last great figures. Theon of Alexandria was a mathematician and astronomer who worked and taught here in the late 4th century. He was the last attested member of the once great Mausion, now likely housed within the Serapeum's walls. He was a scholar dedicated to explaining and preserving the great discoveries of the past, and it was here that his daughter, Hypatia, rose to prominence. A brilliant mind in her own right, she surpassed her father in fame, becoming a celebrated teacher of philosophy and mathematics. Imagine her, a woman in a world dominated by men, holding court in a lecture hall, captivating students from across the empire with her clear explanations of Plato's philosophy or the complex motions of the heavens. She became a living symbol of classical wisdom, a charismatic and respected public intellectual. Theon and Hypatia represent the resilience of the Alexandrian tradition. They show that even after centuries of neglect and a catastrophic sack, the spirit of inquiry survived. The Serapeum was more than just a building full of books. It was a community, a sanctuary where, for one last century, the flame of Greek rationalism and pagan philosophy was carefully tended against a rising wind. But the Serapeum had a fatal weakness. It was not just a library. It was a pagan temple. And as the Roman Empire underwent a profound religious transformation, this dual identity would turn it from a sanctuary into a target. Even as the Serapeum carried the torch of learning forward, the pattern of destruction continued. The death of the Great Library was not a single event, but a war of attrition, a series of blows that chipped away at the city's intellectual resources. Just 2 decades after the Bruchion was annihilated by Aurelian, another Roman emperor would march on Alexandria, and this time The destruction of knowledge would be deliberate, targeted, and precise. It was a calculated purge, driven by political fear. In the year 297 AD, the city of Alexandria once again erupted in revolt against Roman rule, this time led by a usurper named Domitius Domitianus. The Emperor Diocletian, a formidable and deeply authoritarian ruler, personally led his army to crush the rebellion. Diocletian was a great reformer who saved the Roman state from the crisis of the 3rd century, but he did so by imposing rigid, top-down control. He was no stranger to using the full power of the state to enforce ideological conformity, as his great persecution of the Christians would later prove. After a long and difficult siege of Alexandria, he recaptured the city and sought to eliminate the root of the problem. His purge was not just aimed at soldiers and rebels. It was aimed at ideas he considered dangerous. According to historical sources, Diocletian ordered his men to seek out and burn a specific category of books. He targeted all texts related to the practice of alchemy or chemistry. These were not just scrolls of magical spells. The word alchemy encompassed the forerunner of modern chemistry, containing real, practical knowledge of metallurgy, metalworking, the creation of dyes, and other chemical processes. But Diocletian's motivation was purely political and economic. The Roman economy was based on the controlled value of gold and silver. Diocletian feared that Egyptian alchemists might discover the secret to transmuting base metals into gold. If they succeeded, this knowledge would give the wealthy province of Egypt the financial means to fund endless rebellions against Rome. To the rigid, logistical mind of a Roman emperor, it was a terrifying prospect. It was an existential threat, and to remove the threat, he ordered the destruction of the knowledge itself. Imagine the scene. Legionaries, likely illiterate themselves, moving through the workshops and scriptoriums of the city. They were not looking for poetry or philosophy, but for specific symbols and diagrams they had been told to identify as subversive. Scrolls containing generations of scientific observation were seized and tossed onto a great public pyre. This act is profoundly revealing. Unlike the accidental fire of Caesar or the collateral damage of Aurelian's war, this was an act of state-sponsored censorship. It was a clear statement that the Roman state could be actively hostile to knowledge it deemed inconvenient or threatening. This targeted purge further weakened the intellectual foundations of the city. While the main collection at the Serapeum may have been spared, a chilling effect would have spread through the scholarly community. Any research that touched on chemistry or metallurgy would have become suspect, driving such studies into secrecy. The great project of the Ptolemies, to collect all the world's knowledge, had been inverted. Now, emperors were deciding which knowledge was fit to survive. The library seems to endure one blow after another, a testament to the resilience of knowledge. If you're still awake with us, perhaps you can reflect on which loss so far feels the most tragic: the accidental fire, the slow neglect, or the violent sacks of the city. There's no right answer, only the quiet weight of history. The destruction of the Serapeum was not a sudden, isolated event. It was the climax of a century of profound and often violent change. The 4th century saw the Roman Empire convulse, transforming from a state that persecuted Christianity to one that embraced it as the official religion. And nowhere were the growing pains of this new world felt more keenly than in the ancient, crowded, and volatile streets of Alexandria. The city that had once been the world's intellectual crossroads was now becoming a battlefield for its soul. This was a new age, an age of fervent faith, and it was descending upon a very old city. From its earliest days, Alexandria had been a major center for Christian thought. The city's unique intellectual climate, born from the legacy of the library, shaped its version of the new faith. It was here that brilliant theologians like Clement and Origen had worked tirelessly in the 2nd and 3rd centuries to synthesize the Gospels with the tools of Greek philosophy. They argued that faith and reason were not enemies, but partners in the search for truth. They created a uniquely intellectual and sophisticated brand of Christianity, one that could stand on equal footing with the pagan Neoplatonists who still taught in the city as schools. But this intellectual intensity had a darker side. Alexandria became a hotbed of fierce theological disputes. The most famous of these was the Arian controversy, a bitter debate over the very nature of Christ. Was he co-eternal and of the same substance as God the Father, as the Nicene Creed would declare? Or was he a created being divine but subordinate to the Father, as the priest Arius, an Alexandrian himself, proclaimed? This was not a quiet academic disagreement. For the average person, the stakes were eternal. If you prayed to a Christ who is not truly God, was your prayer being heard? Was your salvation at risk? The debate spilled out from the churches and lecture halls into the markets and the docks. Shopkeepers and sailors would argue passionately over the finer points of the Trinity. Families and neighborhoods were split along theological lines, creating deep and bitter social divisions. The city itself was a powder keg. Large, powerful, and often hostile populations of Christians, Jews, and traditional pagans lived in close and uneasy proximity. Alexandria had long been home to one of the largest and most influential Jewish communities in the world, and conflicts between the Jewish and Greek populations predated the rise of Christianity. Now, this new, aggressive faith added another volatile element to the mix. A key force in the city's politics was a uniquely Alexandrian phenomenon, the Parabolani. In theory, they were a Christian brotherhood, a guild of men tasked with the charitable work of collecting the sick and burying the dead. In practice, however, they functioned as the private army of the Patriarch of Alexandria. Numbering in the hundreds, these men were fiercely loyal, physically intimidating, and could be mobilized at a moment's notice to form a mob to break up the meetings of rival Christian factions or to intimidate the city's pagan and Jewish communities. Their presence was a constant, looming threat. The pace of change in the 4th century was breathtaking. An old Christian living in Alexandria might remember hiding in secret to worship during the great persecution under Emperor Diocletian at the start of the century. Then, after the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, they would have seen their faith granted tolerance, their churches built openly. By the end of that same century, under emperors like Theodosius I, they would witness Christianity become the favored, and eventually the only licit religion of the state. The tables had not just turned. They had been completely overturned. Paganism, the ancient tapestry of beliefs that had underpinned Roman and Greek life for 1,000 years, was now increasingly viewed with suspicion and hostility. To the newly empowered church and the Christian emperors, the old gods were demons. Their temples were dens of iniquity, and their continued existence was an affront to the one true God, a threat to the unity and salvation of the empire. As the power of the Christian church in Alexandria grew, its leaders began to look upon the city's magnificent pagan monuments with an ever-deepening hostility. And the grandest, most visible, and most revered of them all was the Serapeum. Its days were numbered. At the center of this looming confrontation was one man, Theophilus, the Patriarch of Alexandria, from 385 to 412 A.D. He was not merely a spiritual leader. He was a master politician, a builder, a schemer, and a man of immense power, often called the Christian Pharaoh. As Patriarch, he controlled a vast network of churches, immense wealth, and the unwavering loyalty of the city's Christian masses, including the formidable Parabolani. He was known for his ruthlessness in crushing theological opponents, and for his skill in navigating the treacherous politics of the imperial court. He was ambitious, utterly convinced of his own righteousness, and aggressively hostile towards any rival power, whether it was a competing Christian sect or the city's ancient pagan traditions. He saw it as his sacred duty to cleanse Alexandria of its idolatrous past and to solidify his own position as the undisputed leader of the city. His ambition found a powerful ally in the imperial palace. The Emperor Theodosius I was a devout and zealous Nicene Christian. He believed that the stability and prosperity of the Roman Empire depended on securing God's favor, and that this could only be achieved by enforcing Christian orthodoxy and eradicating paganism. His piety was reinforced by a famous incident where he was forced into a humiliating public penance by Bishop Ambrose of Milan for ordering a massacre in Thessalonica. This event demonstrated the incredible power the Church now wielded, even over the emperor. It likely strengthened Theodosius's resolve to prove his faith by taking a hard line against paganism. Throughout his reign, he issued a series of increasingly severe edicts. And then, in the year 391 AD, he issued a momentous decree. It authorized the destruction of pagan temples throughout the empire. The decree itself may not have explicitly ordered the destruction of any books or libraries contained within them, but it provided the legal justification for dismantling the physical structures of paganism. It was the weapon Theophilus had been waiting for. He did not wait long to use it. With the emperor's decree in hand, Theophilus sought a pretext to act, a spark to light the fire. He found it in a local dispute. He requested and was granted permission from the emperor to convert a derelict temple of Dionysus into a church. During the renovations, his workers uncovered an underground shrine, a Mithraeum, filled with artifacts from a pagan mystery cult. Instead of quietly removing them, Theophilus saw his opportunity. In a calculated act of provocation, he ordered these sacred pagan objects to be paraded through the main square of the city, holding them up for public ridicule and mockery, framing them as symbols of demonic evil to incite the Christian populace. The reaction was exactly what he must have anticipated. The pagan community of Alexandria, which included many of the city's educated elite, philosophers, and teachers, was enraged. This public desecration was the final straw. Violence erupted. The outraged pagans attacked the Christians, and then, knowing they were outnumbered, they retreated and barricaded themselves inside the strongest and most sacred pagan site in the city, the vast temple complex of the Serapeum. It was both their most holy place and their greatest fortress. From within its fortified walls, They launched raids into the city, capturing Christians and subjecting them to torture. The city descended into open warfare. The stage was now perfectly set. Theophilus, portraying himself as the protector of the Christian flock, gathered a huge crowd and approached the besieged temple. There, he unrolled the imperial scroll and read aloud the emperor's decree, the words that gave them the full legal authority of the Roman state to destroy the temple. It was, effectively, a declaration of holy war. The mob roared its approval. The doom of the Serapeum was sealed. With the backing of the emperor and the fervent energy of the mob, the final violent confrontation began. The standoff at the Serapeum lasted for some time. The pagans, now rebels fighting for their sacred ground, were well defended within the massive temple complex. They were led by a philosopher named Olympius, who encouraged them that it was honorable to die for the faith of their ancestors, arguing that while the statues could be destroyed, the divine powers they represented were eternal. They launched attacks from the temple walls, and the fighting in the streets below was bloody. The Roman governor of the city was largely powerless, caught between a pagan rebellion and a patriarch who held the real power. Eventually, a message arrived from the Emperor Theodosius himself. He offered the besieged pagans a full amnesty for the violence they had committed. But the condition was absolute. They had to surrender the temple. Faced with the futility of their position, the pagan defenders accepted the terms and abandoned their fortress. Once they had gone, Theophilus entered the temple, not with a prayer of peace, but at the head of a demolition crew. The contemporary accounts describe a scene of methodical, triumphant destruction. The Christian mob surged through the gates, their primary target the magnificent, colossal statue of the god Serapis. This was the spiritual heart of the temple, a wonder of craftsmanship made of wood, precious metals, and jewels, so revered that it was said a touch from it could make the heavens and earth tremble. For a moment, the crowd hesitated, awestruck and fearful of divine retribution. Then, a Roman soldier was given an axe and ordered to strike. He struck the statue's jaw. A cry went up from the crowd, but when no lightning bolt came from the sky, their fear turned to ecstatic frenzy. They fell upon the idol with axes and hammers, hacked it to pieces, tied ropes to its limbs, and dragged the fragments through the city to be burned. After the idol was gone, they turned to the temple itself. Under Theophilus's direct supervision, the mob began to systematically demolish the ancient structure, pulling down the walls and smashing the columns. Their goal was not just to destroy a building, but to erase a memory. In its place, a Christian church and a martyr's shrine were eventually built, a physical symbol of the victory of the new faith over the old, a permanent declaration of spiritual conquest. But what of the scrolls? What of the great library of the Serapeum? This is the crucial, frustrating question. The triumphant Christian historians, who describe the destruction of the temple in celebratory detail, never mention a library. They speak of destroying idols, of cleansing a pagan sanctuary. The destruction of a world-famous collection of literature is never mentioned. This silence is deafening. The pagan historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing just before these events, had already described the Serapeum's library in the past tense, suggesting its holdings may have already been diminished. So what happened? The most likely answer is not a dramatic single fire. It's a sadder, more complex story. Many scholars, seeing the rising tide of Christian intolerance, may have removed the most valuable scrolls in the years and months leading up to the siege, spiriting them away to private homes. What remained was likely destroyed in the chaos without specific mention, viewed by the mob as nothing more than pagan clutter, swept away with the rest of the rubble. The legend of a great library fire is powerful, but the quiet truth of gradual decline and piecemeal destruction is perhaps even more tragic. The physical destruction of the Serapeum in 391 AD, a landmark event. It was the end of a building, but the end of the intellectual tradition it represented, the final extinguishing of the light of classical inquiry in Alexandria, is best embodied by the story of one remarkable individual who lived and worked in its shadow. Her life and her death serve as the final somber chapter in our story. Her name was Hypatia. She was the daughter of Theon, the mathematician, and the last known scholar formally associated with the Halcyon. She was, in essence, the final heir to the great intellectual tradition of Alexandria. And she was a prodigy. In an age when women were almost entirely excluded from public and academic life, Hypatia became one of the most celebrated thinkers of her time. She was a brilliant mathematician, an astronomer, and a charismatic teacher of Neoplatonic philosophy. This philosophy, with its focus on attaining union with a transcendent reality through reason and virtue, was a sophisticated and powerful alternative to Christian theology. She was admired not only for her powerful intellect, but for her character and her dedication to a life of the mind. Her lectures were famous, attracting crowds of devoted students, including prominent Christians as well as pagans. She was a figure who transcended the bitter religious divides of the city, a symbol of an older, more tolerant way of life. But this very influence would prove to be her undoing. After Theophilus died, he was succeeded as patriarch by his nephew Cyril, a man even more ambitious and intolerant than his uncle. Cyril quickly entered into a bitter political feud with the city's secular Roman governor Orestes. Orestes was a Christian, but he represented the civil authority of the state and resented Cyril's attempts to dominate the city's politics. Hypatia was a close friend and respected advisor to Orestes. Cyril and his hardline supporters saw this alliance as a profound threat. To them, Hypatia was not just a political obstacle, she was a spiritual one. She was a pagan woman of immense charisma and intellectual authority, a living symbol of the philosophical tradition that they sought to eradicate. She defied the patriarchal norms of the church and offered a compelling non-Christian path to wisdom. Rumors began to circulate. Hypatia was a witch who had enchanted the governor. She was the one preventing a reconciliation between Orestes and Cyril. She was the enemy of the church. The end came in March of the year 415 AD, during the season of Lent. As Hypatia was riding through the city in her chariot, she was ambushed by a mob. It was a mob of Christian fanatics, likely the Parabolani, incited by the vicious rumors and acting in support of their patriarch. They dragged the celebrated philosopher from her chariot. They hauled her to a nearby church, the Caesareum, which had once been a temple built by Cleopatra. Inside this sacred Christian space, they stripped her, and with sharpened oyster shells and pieces of broken pottery, they flayed her skin from her bones. Then they took her mutilated remains and burned them. Her murder was not just a crime, it was a message. It was a terrifying demonstration of what could happen to those who defied the new religious order. The news sent a shockwave of horror and fear through what remained of the intellectual community in the Roman world. Her death marked a definitive point of no return. For the few pagan scholars who remained in Alexandria, it was a clear signal that the city was no longer safe for them, or for the kind of open inquiry and tolerant debate that Hypatia had championed. The space for public, non-Christian thought was gone. Many packed their scrolls and fled, seeking refuge in the few remaining havens of classical thought. The murder of Hypatia was the symbolic end of an era. With her death, the last light of the great Alexandrian intellectual tradition, a tradition that had burned for over 700 years, was finally and brutally extinguished. The story of Hypatia is a deeply somber note in this long history. It shows how the war on buildings and books became a war on people. If you are still listening, take a quiet moment to think about how fragile intellectual freedom can be in the face of zealotry. Our investigation has sifted through centuries of decay, violence, and ideological warfare. We have seen the library wounded by Roman generals and starved by Roman emperors. We have witnessed its last great sanctuary torn down by a Christian mob. Yet one final suspect remains, the one named in the most famous and dramatic story of the library's end. We now turn our attention to the Arab conquest of Egypt and the final accusation in this 1,000-year case. The story is powerful and simple. In the year 642 A, the Arab general Amr ibn al-As captured the city of Alexandria. A subordinate, we are told, impressed by the immense wisdom still housed in the city, asked the general what should be done with all the books. The general, being a military man and not a scholar, dutifully sent a letter to the caliph, Omar, in Medina, asking for his judgment. The messenger traveled the long, dusty road to Arabia and awaited the caliph's reply. When the letter returned, its message was chillingly clear. Regarding the books you mentioned, the caliph had supposedly written, if what is written in them is in agreement with the book of God, we have no need of them, for the book of God is sufficient. And if what is written in them is opposed to the book of God, destroy them. The tale then reaches its spectacular conclusion. The scrolls and codices of Alexandria were gathered up and distributed as fuel to the city's 4,000 bathhouses. So vast was the collection, the story claims that it took 6 months to burn it all. It is a story of ultimate intolerance, of a clash between a new, austere faith and the accumulated knowledge of the classical world. It is also, almost certainly, a complete fiction. The first and most damning piece of evidence against this story is the profound silence of the centuries. This dramatic event, the 6-month burning of a world-famous library, is never mentioned by anyone for over 500 years. Contemporary accounts of the Arab conquest simply do not contain it. The Christian chronicler John of Niku, an Egyptian bishop writing in the late 7th century, described the conquest in detail. He was hostile to the Arabs and had no reason to protect their reputation. Yet he says nothing about a destroyed library. Had such a spectacular act of cultural destruction occurred, he surely would have recorded it as a great tragedy and a mark against the conquerors. But he does not. No one does. The story appears for the very first time in the 13th century, in the writings of a Syrian scholar named Abdi al-Latif al-Baghdadi, and was later popularized by another writer, Bar-Hebrius. 500 years separate the alleged event from its first telling. It is the historical equivalent of a rumor. Furthermore, we must ask a simple question. What library were they supposed to have burned? As our long investigation has shown, by the year 642, the great institutions of Alexandrian learning were already ghosts. The main library in the Bruchion was likely destroyed during Aurelian's sack of the city 400 years earlier. The daughter library at the Serapeum was torn down by Theophilus and his mob 250 years before the Arabs arrived. After centuries of neglect, purges, riots, and censorship, it is highly improbable that a large, centralized, state-funded library even existed in Alexandria to be destroyed. What likely remained were smaller, scattered collections in private homes, monasteries, and churches. There was no single, grand target left. So where did the story come from? Today, historians almost universally reject it as propaganda. It may have been a piece of folklore, or a moral tale intended to illustrate the piety of Caliph Omar, that was later written down and mistaken for fact. It is also possible that the story was invented or embellished much later, during the time of the Crusades, when tales of Muslim barbarism were a useful tool for stoking conflict. The story of the bathhouses, with its impossibly grand numbers, has all the hallmarks of a legend, not an eyewitness account. And so, the final great suspect in our case is exonerated. The Arabs did not destroy the Library of Alexandria. They could not have. It was already gone. With this final major suspect debunked, we are left with a more complex and unsettling picture. If it wasn't Caesar or Theophilus or Omar in a single decisive act, then who or what is truly to blame? This question forces us to look beyond the convenience of a single story and into the psychology of how we remember the past. Why did the narrative of a single catastrophic fire become so popular? Why, for centuries, have we been so eager to point the finger at one man or one group? The answer lies in our deep human need for a simple story. History is complex. It is a messy, sprawling, and often mundane process. The slow, administrative death of a great institution over generations is a difficult concept to grasp, and it makes for a poor tale. There is no drama in it, no clear villain, no single moment of tragic loss. A great fire, on the other hand, is a powerful and emotionally satisfying narrative. It is an epic tragedy. It has a clear cause, a dramatic climax, and a terrible, definitive end. It is a story that is easy to tell, easy to remember, and easy to be angered by. This need for a simple narrative has been exploited by different groups for different reasons. Each creating a scapegoat has served their own purposes. The story of Caesar's fire, for instance, is the perfect classical tragedy. It pits a great man of action against a great monument of thought. It is a dramatic, personal story, centered on one of history's most recognizable figures. It encapsulates the idea that the pen is mighty, but the sword, in a moment of carelessness, can be mightier still. Later, during the Enlightenment of the 18th century, thinkers like the great historian Edward Gibbon popularized a different narrative. For them, the prime culprit was Christian intolerance. The story of Theophilus and the destruction of the Serapeum became a powerful parable about the dangers of religious fanaticism. They used the death of the library, a symbol of classical pagan reason, to critique the power of organized religion in their own time. It was a useful and effective story for their own intellectual and political project. In their telling, the Christians became the villains in a grand narrative about the triumph of superstition over science. And as we have seen, the tale of the Arab conquest served a similar purpose in later centuries. It became a piece of anti-Muslim propaganda, a story that helped to create a clear cultural divide between a supposedly enlightened, rational West and a dogmatic, book-burning East. It was a story that proved useful during the Crusades and later during the age of European colonialism. Each of these stories simplifies a complex reality to create a clear enemy. The truth is that the library's demise was mundane. It died from budget cuts. It died from administrative neglect and political purges. It died from the slow, relentless decay of fragile papyrus that no one had the funds to recopy. This reality is unsettling. It suggests that great things can be lost not with a bang, but with a whimper. It suggests that collective apathy can be as destructive as an invading army. This is a difficult lesson to accept. It is far easier to blame a single villain than to accept a systemic failure. This very act of simplification, this need for a scapegoat, is in its own way a form of historical cover-up. It obscures the more complex truth, and in doing so, it prevents us from learning the real lesson of Alexandria, that civilization is a fragile ecosystem, and its treasures are lost not only in moments of great violence, but also in the long, quiet years of simple neglect. Let us now move past the myths and the scapegoats. Let us step away from the convenience of a single story. After sifting through 1,000 years of evidence, it is time to deliver the final verdict in this ancient case. The question was never truly who burned the Library of Alexandria. The question should have been, what destroyed it? And the answer is not one thing, but many. There was no single murderer. This was a death by 1,000 cuts inflicted over centuries. The verdict is that this was a systemic failure. The responsibility is shared across generations, cultures, and ideologies. Let us name the true culprits. Our first culprit is fading patronage. The library was born from the lavish, competitive, and personal ambition of the Ptolemaic kings. They saw it as their dynasty's crown jewel. When they vanished, replaced by pragmatic Roman emperors who saw Egypt as a granary, the lifeblood of the institution was cut off. The endless river of gold that funded acquisitions, maintenance, and scholarly salaries slowed to a trickle, and the library began to starve. Our second culprit is political instability and violence. The library was a casualty of war, time and again. The purge of scholars under Ptolemy VIII was a grievous self-inflicted wound. The desperate military act of Julius Caesar inflicted a terrible blow. The brutal sack of the Bruchion quarter by the Emperor Aurelian in the 3rd century was a catastrophe, a physical annihilation of the district where the main library stood. These were not attacks on knowledge itself, but knowledge was caught in the crossfire and torn apart. Our third culprit is religious intolerance. The rise of a militant and politically powerful Christianity in the 4th century created a new kind of threat, one aimed not at buildings, but at ideas. The new faith, in its quest for absolute truth and imperial unity, became hostile to the pluralism of pagan thought. This culminated in the state-sanctioned destruction of the Serapeum in 391 A.D., the last great repository of classical learning, and it fostered the climate of fear that led to the murder of Hypatia, silencing the last echoes of the library's tradition. Our fourth culprit is simply natural decay. Papyrus is a fragile medium. It was never meant to last for millennia. In the humid climate of Alexandria, it was in a constant battle against moisture, insects, and the simple passage of time. The only defense was a dedicated, well-funded team of scribes, constantly recopying aging texts onto new rolls. When the funding for this mundane but essential task disappeared, the scrolls began their slow, silent return to dust. Time itself was an unceasing fire in slow motion. Our final culprit is the shifting tide of human thought. The world changed. The intellectual priorities of the late Roman and early medieval worlds were different from those of the Hellenistic age. The Greek model of broad, secular, scientific inquiry gave way to new questions, new modes of thinking, dominated by theology and commentary. The very spirit that had animated the library in its golden age had simply faded from the world. These forces did not act alone. They compounded each other in a cascade of failure. Neglect made the institution vulnerable. War shattered its body. Intolerance poisoned its soul. And time consumed what was left. There was no single fatal blow. The Library of Alexandria suffered from a long and terminal illness, with many contributing factors. The case is closed not with the satisfying conviction of a single culprit, but with the somber recognition that a civilization failed to protect its own mind. The library is gone. The verdict has been delivered. But in the silence left behind, we are forced to wonder about the ghosts of the knowledge that was lost. The ruins and the rubble are one kind of loss. But the true, immeasurable loss is the knowledge that vanished forever, the voices that fell silent. What did we lose? Can we ever truly know? We can only glimpse the phantoms. We lost the complete works of Aristophanes, the physician who first performed human dissections and discovered that the brain, not the heart, was the seat of consciousness and intelligence. What other secrets of the human body did he uncover, only to have them fade into oblivion? We lost the book of Aristarchus of Samos, who argued that the earth revolved around the sun nearly 1,800 years before Copernicus. We can only imagine how the course of science might have changed if his revolutionary idea had not been dismissed and lost. We lost the authentic voices of the ancient world's historians. The history of Egypt, written in 30 volumes by the Egyptian priest Manetho, survives only in fragments and summaries quoted by other authors. We are left with a second-hand echo of a nation's story, told from the inside. We lost the history of Babylonia, written by the priest Berossus, which would have given us an unparalleled insight into the culture of ancient Mesopotamia. We lost hundreds of plays by the great Greek tragedians. We know that Sophocles wrote over 120 plays. We have only 7. Aeschylus and Euripides were just as prolific, and their losses are just as vast. An entire library of poetry, drama, and insight into the human condition is gone, leaving only a handful of survivors to hint at the majesty of what once was. Perhaps the most heartbreaking loss of all was the loss of the map to this vanished world, the Pinax. The 1-100- and -20-volume catalog created by Callimachus was a complete bibliographic record of all the knowledge housed in the library. To lose the Pinax was to lose the guide to the lost world itself. It means we are left without a full understanding of the scale of our own ignorance. We can list the famous works we know are missing, but the true loss lies in the unknown unknowns, the books we do not even know we lost, the histories of forgotten peoples, the philosophical schools that left no trace, the scientific theories that were never passed on, the poems dedicated to loves and sorrows we can now never share. This is the true, immeasurable void. The Library of Alexandria was not murdered in a single fiery crime of passion. It was the victim of a slow, creeping, and collective failure of human civilization to value, maintain, and protect its own intellectual heritage. The case is closed not with the conviction of a single culprit, but with the quiet, sorrowful understanding that we were all responsible. The blame lies with the fading ambition of patrons, the short-sighted violence of soldiers, the righteous certainty of zealots, and the simple, everyday neglect of generations who took their inheritance for granted. And now, with this long investigation complete, It is time to let the quiet of the ages settle in. Let the echoes of the past soothe you into a deep and peaceful rest. Good night. For so long, our story has been one of endings. An investigation into a slow and painful death, a eulogy for a world of lost knowledge. But the story of knowledge is not only a story of loss, it is also a story of miraculous survival, of secret paths and unlikely saviors, of a light that was passed from hand to hand through the gathering darkness. The great library may have vanished, but the knowledge it once housed was a living thing. And like all living things, it found ways to endure, to migrate, and to be reborn in new lands, long after its original home had turned to dust. This is the epilogue to our tragedy. It is the story of how the embers of Alexandria, carried on the winds of history, reignited fires of learning all across the world. While Western Europe entered a period of fragmentation and upheaval after the fall of Rome, the Eastern Roman Empire, known to us as Byzantium, endured for another 1,000 years. Its magnificent capital, Constantinople, became a new Alexandria, a fortress of classical learning. Here, the intellectual heritage of Greece was not seen as a relic of a pagan past, but as the foundation of their own Christian civilization. Within the city's massive walls, in imperial libraries and the quiet workshops known as scriptoria, scribes saw it as their sacred duty to copy and preserve the great works of their ancestors. They painstakingly transcribed the philosophy of Plato, the histories of Thucydides, and the plays of Sophocles. Emperors like Constantine VII, himself a scholar, commissioned massive encyclopedias to condense and categorize vast fields of ancient knowledge, ensuring their survival. It was a monumental effort of conservation, a direct continuation of the Hellenic tradition. Without the work of these anonymous Byzantine scholars, a vast portion of classical Greek literature, including most of the historical works we have today, would be utterly lost. They were the first crucial link in the long chain of survival. But the knowledge did not only travel forward in time, it traveled outward, along new paths of culture and language. In the 8th and 9th centuries, as the Islamic Caliphate reached its golden age, a new intellectual center rose in the brand new city of Baghdad. Here, the Abbasid caliphs, particularly Al-Man, established a great institution called the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. This was a conscious echo of the Alexandrian project, a state-sponsored effort to gather all the world's learning under one roof. The caliphs poured immense resources into a grand translation movement, sending emissaries to Byzantium and beyond to purchase Greek manuscripts at any price. According to legend, translators were sometimes paid the weight of their finished books in solid gold, a powerful testament to the value placed on this ancient wisdom. Within the House of Wisdom, a diverse community of scholars, historian Christians, like the brilliant Hanan ibn Ishaq, Jews and Muslims, worked side by side, translating the great works of Greek science, medicine, and philosophy into Arabic. It was here that Aristotle's logic, Euclid's geometry, and Ptolemy's Almagest, the foundational text of astronomy for over a millennium, found a new and eager audience. And critically, these Arab scholars were not mere custodians. They were brilliant innovators who who engaged deeply with the texts, critiquing, expanding, and building upon the knowledge they had inherited. Thinkers like Al-Kindi integrated Greek philosophy with Islamic theology. The Persian polymath Avicenna wrote the Canon of Medicine, a monumental encyclopedia that combined the work of Galen with his own clinical discoveries. It was so comprehensive that it became the standard medical textbook in European universities for over 600 years. In Islamic Spain, the philosopher Averroes wrote extensive, penetrating commentaries on Aristotle. He argued so forcefully for the harmony of faith and reason that his work would profoundly influence both Jewish and Christian thought for centuries to come. They took the flickering torch from the Greeks and made it burn brighter than ever, creating a golden age of science and philosophy. And from here, from the great intellectual centers of Baghdad and Cordoba, the light found its way back to a Europe that was just beginning to reawaken. In the multicultural cities of Toledo in Spain and Aliro in Sicily, Christian and Jewish scholars learned Arabic and began the painstaking work of translating these texts once more, this time from Arabic into Latin. It was through this channel that much of Aristotle's complex philosophy was reintroduced to Western Europe, challenging the Church and sparking the intellectual movement known as scholasticism. At the same time, in the quietest and most remote corners of Europe, another thread of survival was being woven. In monasteries perched on windswept islands off the coast of Ireland or nestled in alpine valleys, monks spent their lives in cold scriptoriums, meticulously copying manuscripts by candlelight. While their primary duty was to the Holy Scriptures, they also copied the works of pagan Latin authors, preserving them through centuries of turmoil. The story of knowledge is not a straight line. It is a river with many tributaries, a complex web connecting the scribes of Constantinople, the translators of Baghdad, and the monks of Ireland in one great, shared human endeavor to keep the past alive. While some of the precious texts found their way to safety, perhaps the more powerful survivor was the idea of the library itself. Long after its physical walls had crumbled and its last scrolls had turned to dust, the Library of Alexandria endured as a potent symbol. It became something more than a historical place. It became a myth, a story we tell ourselves about the heights humanity can aspire to and the depths of loss we can suffer. Its physical form was gone, but its ghost began to haunt the imagination of the world, growing more powerful with each passing century. It became the ultimate symbol of universal knowledge, of intellectual freedom, and of the profound fragility of civilization. The library represents a powerful and timeless ideal, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. In a world where so many great institutions of learning are tied to a specific religious dogma, the Library of Alexandria, in our memory, stands for something different. It was a secular project, sponsored by the state, with the audacious goal of understanding the entire world, not just one vision of it. It was a place where mathematics, poetry, astronomy, and history were all seen as equal and worthy paths to truth. It is for this reason that it has been invoked by scholars, writers, and scientists for centuries as a lost paradise of the mind, an intellectual Garden of Eden from which we were cast out by ignorance and violence. This idea of a lost golden age of perfect knowledge is a recurring theme in human culture, and the library has become the ultimate embodiment of that dream. It is a symbol of a rational, ordered world that we fear we can never fully reclaim. In the 20th century, this idea was cemented in the popular imagination by the astronomer and science communicator Carl Sagan. In his landmark television series, Cosmos, he took millions of viewers on a tour of the recreated Great Library. Walking through its imaginary halls, he spoke with gentle, reverent awe of the wonders it contained. His telling of the story made its loss feel personal to all of us. He mourned its passing, not as a distant historical event, but as a direct blow to the progress of the human species. For a generation, Sagan transformed the library from a half-forgotten historical fact into a modern icon of scientific wonder and a martyr to the forces of intolerance. Because of this, the library also serves as a timeless cautionary tale. Its story is a stark warning about the dangers of dogmatism, of what happens when one group believes it has a monopoly on truth. It is a lesson about the devastating cost of war and political instability, which so often treat culture and knowledge as collateral damage. And perhaps most uncomfortably, it is a story about the quiet, creeping danger of societal neglect. It forces us to confront the fact that a civilization can lose its most precious assets, not only in a blaze of glory, but through simple, collective apathy. In this way, the grand dream of the Ptolemies is a direct ancestor of our own most ambitious modern projects. The desire to gather all the world's scrolls under one roof is the ancient precursor to the dream of the Internet, of vast digital archives, and of universal access to information. But the parallel also offers a warning. Our new digital library is also fragile. It is threatened not by fire, but by misinformation that pollutes its streams. It is threatened not by the decay of papyrus, but by the decay of digital formats and the quiet corruption of data. And it is threatened by the rise of echo chambers, where we are encouraged to read only from one small section of the library, reinforcing our own biases. The story of Alexandria compels us to look inward. It asks us to consider what our own society truly values and what libraries we might be neglecting today. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but as an idea, it remains a mirror, forcing us to ask if we are being any wiser than the generations who let it fall. After reflecting on the library as a powerful and enduring idea, it is only natural to want to ground it in the physical world, to ask, what is actually left? Archaeologists and historians have long searched for the ghost of the great institution, hoping to find some tangible trace of its existence in the soil of modern Alexandria. But the search has been one of the most challenging and frustrating endeavors in all of archaeology. A hunt for a ghost in a city that has been continuously inhabited for more than 2,000 years. The primary obstacle is that ancient Alexandria is buried directly beneath modern Alexandria. It is a vibrant, densely populated city of over 5 million people. The ancient Bruchian Quarter, where the Mauseon and the Great Library most likely stood, is now covered by apartment buildings, shops, and busy streets. To find the foundations of a specific building from 2,000 years ago, you would have to demolish a modern apartment block or a busy street. It is a place where the past is held hostage by the present. Furthermore, the geography of the city itself has changed. Due to earthquakes and the slow subsidence of the land over 2 millennia, significant parts of the ancient royal quarter are now underwater, submerged in the city's eastern harbor. The ground has shifted, and the sea has claimed many of the secrets. Because of these immense challenges, no definitive ruins of the Great Library or the Mausoleum have ever been identified. There is no foundation stone with an inscription, no series of collapsed columns that can be pointed to with certainty. This physical absence is a core part of its modern identity. The lack of a body almost makes the ghost more powerful. It is a place that seems to exist more concretely in the pages of history books than it does in the ground. Yet, there have been glimmers of discovery. In the 1990s, a Polish Egyptian archaeological team was excavating near the site of the Serapeum, the location of the daughter library. Here, they unearthed something extraordinary. It was a complex of at least 13 large, identical lecture halls, or auditoria. Each one was built in the same way, with rows of tiered benches and an elevated seat at the front for a lecturer. It was unmistakably a university, the physical remnant of a great teaching institution. The archaeologists calculated that the complex could have accommodated up to 5,000 students, suggesting a bustling academic life with a curriculum that must have covered everything from rhetoric to philosophy to mathematics. While this was not the great library itself, the discovery was electrifying. It was the first tangible proof of the vast educational complex that the ancient writers had described. At the same time, in the waters of the harbor, underwater archaeologists have made their own spectacular finds. They have mapped the submerged portions of the royal palaces, discovering colossal statues, sphinx, and ornate paving stones from the time of Cleopatra. These discoveries provide a breathtaking glimpse into the lost splendor of the world in which the library existed. But still, the library itself remains elusive. The frustration of the search, the near misses, the tantalizing clues that lead nowhere, all of this adds to the legend. The fact that we cannot find it confirms its total obliteration from the physical landscape. It reinforces the scale of the destruction that took place, and it allows the library to remain what it has become, a dream, an idea that inhabits the whole of our collective imagination, untethered to a single plot of land. But that is not where our story ends. While the old stones may be lost, the spirit has been reborn in glass and steel on the shores of the Mediterranean. For centuries, the story of the Library of Alexandria was a story of absence, a memory of a lost paradise. But at the turn of our own millennium, an audacious dream took hold to give that memory a new home, to resurrect the spirit of the ancient library for the modern world. This was not a project of restoration, but one of rebirth. And so, on the same shores where the ancient wonder once stood, a new one began to rise. In 2002, after years of planning and a monumental international effort, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina was inaugurated. This was not the project of a single king's ambition, but a testament to global cooperation. supported by UNESCO and funded by countries from around the world. The new library was a recognition that the legacy of Alexandria belonged to all of humanity. It was a collective effort to relight the flame that had been extinguished so long ago, a global statement of hope and a commitment to the value of shared knowledge. The building itself is a masterpiece of modern architecture, deeply imbued with symbolism. From the outside, it appears as a vast, tilted disk emerging from a pool of water. It is designed to evoke the image of a rising sun, a sun of knowledge dawning once more over the Mediterranean. The massive, curving outer wall is clad in beautiful gray Aswan granite, the same stone used by the ancient pharaohs. And carved into this wall are the characters and symbols of 120 different human scripts, from ancient hieroglyphs to modern alphabets to binary code. This wall is a powerful and inclusive statement, a celebration of the diversity of human language and communication. It announces that this library belongs to everyone. Inside, the building is even more breathtaking. The main reading room is an immense, open space, the largest of its kind in the world. Its roof, tilted to the sky, fills the space with diffuse, indirect sunlight, designed to be gentle on the eyes of readers and the pages of books. 7 terraced levels cascade downwards, capable of holding 8 million volumes. To stand on the top terrace and look down is to witness a cathedral of learning, a space of quiet, contemplative grandeur filled with young Egyptian students and international scholars working side by side. It is the physical embodiment of a hopeful future. But the mission of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina is wisely different from that of its ancient predecessor. The dream of possessing every book in the world is an impossibility in our age of information. Instead, the modern library's mission is one of dialogue and understanding. It is a major research library for Egypt and the Middle East, but it is also a cultural complex containing museums, art galleries, a planetarium, and conference centers. Its stated goal is to be a window on Egypt for the world, and a window on the world for Egypt. It hosts conferences on freedom of speech, on scientific cooperation, on interfaith dialogue. It champions openness, critical thinking, and the free exchange of ideas, the very principles that were crushed in the city's violent past. It is, in essence, an act of faith in the power of knowledge to heal and unite. It stands proudly on the Alexandrian Corniche, a short walk from where the original library is believed to have stood. This proximity is no accident. The new Bibliotheca is a conscious and hopeful act of continuity. It is a statement that while intolerance and violence may win temporary victories, they do not have the final word. The story of the Library of Alexandria, then, is not just one of loss. It is a story of survival, of transmission, and ultimately, of rebirth. The fire, the neglect, and the strife could destroy the scrolls and the stones, but they could not destroy the human desire to know, to question, and to understand. That desire sleeps in all of us. And now, as our story ends, it is time for you to drift into your own quiet world of dreams. Sleep well,